Hello everyone, and welcome to the second in this year's series of BCLT Research Seminars in Literary Translation. My name is Duncan Large, and I'm the Academic Director of the British Centre for Literary Translation, which is based at the University of East Anglia in Norwich, England. Unable to meet in person on campus at UEA this year, we've moved these seminars online and are delighted to welcome many new participants as a consequence. If you haven't joined us for an event before and would like to find out more about the British Centre for Literary Translation, please check us out on social media at BCLT UEA and on the web at bclt.org.uk, where you'll find information about all our activities, including the YouTube recording of last week's research seminar with Franca Cavagnoli, and booking details for the remaining 2 seminars in this term's series. Now then, it's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Jacob Blakesley is Associate Professor in Comparative Literature and Literary Translation at the University of Leeds, where he's also co-director of the Leeds Centre for Dante Studies. Jacob received his PhD in Italian from the University of Chicago in 2011. He's the author of 2 monographs, Modern Italian Poets, Translators of the Impossible, University of Toronto Press 2014, and A Sociological Approach to Poetry Translation, Modern European Poet Translators, which came out last year from Routledge. He's also edited the volume Sociologies of Poetry Translation, Emerging Perspectives, Bloomsbury 2018, which features a chapter by our UEA colleague, Tom Ball. Jacob's own poetry translations from Italian and other languages have appeared in various journals, including Stand. He also edited and translated a selection of great Italian short stories of the 20th century, published by Dover.
What is a get-at?
Bilingual edition in 2013. In 2017 to 18, he held a US National Endowment for the Arts Literary Translation Fellowship for a project on translating the modern experimental Italian poet Edoardo Sanguinetti. A member of the Executive Committee of the British Comparative Literature Association, Jacob chairs the BCLT John Dryden Translation Competition, and is, I'm particularly pleased to say, my co-editor on the new Routledge monograph series, Studies in Literary Translation. As you can tell, Jacob's research interests are spread more or less evenly between the medieval and the modern. Just this month, he has a new piece in Comparative Critical Studies titled World Literature According to Wikipedia Popularity and Book Translations, the Case of Modern Italian Poets. But he's also gearing up for the Anno Dantesco, that is 2021, marking the 700th anniversary of Dante's death by organizing a Dante conference in Leeds. With Federica Coluzzi, he's currently editing a new collection on Dante's Vita Nova, and his topic this evening relates to his ongoing monograph dedicated to the worldwide translations and translators of Dante's Divine Comedy. Before I hand over to Jacob, then, let me just say 3 things about the logistics of today's session. First, we are recording Jacob's seminar, and we'll be making it available afterwards on the BCLT's YouTube channel. With that in mind, can I ask you please to make sure your camera is turned off and your mic muted so that the sound quality is not impaired. And then finally, do please feel free to ask questions via the chat function, and I'll put them to Jacob on your behalf at the end of his presentation. Let me now hand over then to Jacob Blakesley, who joins us today from Rome, and his presentation is titled Global Translations of Dante's Divine Comedy from the Renaissance until Today. Jacob.
Thanks very much for that kind introduction, Duncan. Let me just try to share my screen. Okay, wonderful. So I'd like to thank Duncan for inviting me to give a talk today in the BCLT Research Seminar series. My talk will address translations of Dante's Divine Comedy from a social cultural perspective. I aim to show how studying a text like the comedy can shed important light on a number of different issues, such as literary tradition, censorship, and literary canonicity in translation. The theoretical framework of my essay is based on Franco Moretti's distant reading approach, namely large-scale literary analysis, which I've applied to translation on a number of occasions. Most recently in my monograph, A Sociological Approach to Poetry Translation, Modern European Poet Translators. Using distant reading implies analyzing translations on a large scale without necessarily doing any microanalysis. The reason that I'm deliberately using a distant reading approach here is that the vast landscape of Dante translations has never been mapped before. And at the same time, the number of different languages involved far outstrip the linguistic and literary competence of any individual scholar. For this reason, in this talk, I'll be drawing on the research of many scholars from numerous languages, and it's largely thanks to their scholarship that I've been able to write this paper. Now, the Divine Comedy, written by Dante Alighieri between 1307 and 1321, poses seemingly intractable problems for a translator, and therefore rich material to study in its circulation and transmission in other languages. The Comedy, a work composed in 3 sections or canticles, cantiche, Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso, narrates the journey of Dante the pilgrim through the 3 otherworldly realms, guided by Virgil and Beatrice, until he reaches salvation in the contemplation of God. Theological and moral concepts familiar to the readers with a Christian, especially Roman Catholic background, means that there's a whole baggage of specific cultural information that is unfamiliar or unknown to many other cultures. Whether monotheistic, like Judaism and Islam, polytheistic, like Hinduism, or non-theistic, like Buddhism. The Comedy is structured on a moral system deriving from Aristotle and Aquinas, in which figures in Inferno represent specific sins, figures in Purgatorio, sinful dispositions, and figures in Paradiso, virtues. Yet the very definitions and classifications of sins, sinful dispositions, and virtues differs by culture, religion, and language. Another potential obstacle is the political framework of the poem, which revolves around 2 Italian political factions during the Middle Ages, the Guelphs and Ghibellines, a relatively local historical and political context distant to modern-day readers. And last but not least, the very framework of the poem is an innovative formal pattern invented by Dante. The tercets and terza rima, with their interlocking ABA, BCB, CDC rhyme scheme, and a flexible 11-syllable meter, is foreign to virtually every other poetic tradition by dint of its novelty, and thus poses significant problems for any translator. My own research, drawing on National Library catalogs, as well as printed bibliographies, has shown that Dante's Divine Comedy, whether the whole poem or just complete single canticles like Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso, has been translated into 66 languages, from Afrikaans to Yiddish, often repeatedly, in addition to about 24 Italian dialects. All the official European Union languages, except Estonian, possess complete translations of the Divine Comedy. It is present in the Middle East and North African regions, with multiple translations into Arabic, Hebrew, Persian, and Turkish, into East Asian, with numerous translations into Mandarin Chinese, Korean, and Japanese, and in the South Asian subcontinent, with translations into national languages like Bengali, Nepali, and Urdu. The comedy has also been translated into dead and artificial languages like Latin and Esperanto. Historically speaking, the first published translation of a single canticle of the Divine Comedy was published in Spain in 1515, with the first translation of the complete comedy into French at the end of the 16th century. And here I'm leaving aside manuscript translations. While the first complete German translation appeared in 1769, the first published English translation of the entire Commedia appeared only in 1802. It was during the 19th century, spurred on by Romanticism, that complete translations of the comedy were published in European languages like Catalan, Czech, Danish, Dutch, Greek, Hungarian, Polish, Portuguese, Spanish, and Swedish, as well as Russian. It took considerably longer for translators belonging to non-European languages to translate the whole comedy. Japanese, Arabic, and Turkish saw their first complete translations in the period between the First and Second World Wars, while the first complete translations into Mandarin Chinese, Persian, Hebrew, Korean, Bengali, and Urdu all occurred after the Second World War. Even today, as we approach the 700th anniversary of Dante's Comedy next year, we find that it is continually being translated into new languages. We can think of the relatively recent first translations into Afrikaans, Macedonian, Tamil, Vietnamese, Icelandic, and Kannada. Alongside these recent complete translations into a number of new languages, Many other languages have had multiple translations of Dante's Commedia in the past 20 years, as you can see on the slide. English above all, but also Spanish and Turkish, Japanese and Persian, French and German, and a handful of languages with 2 translations during the same 20-year period, such as Arabic, Chinese, Dutch, Hebrew, Hungarian, Polish, and Portuguese. It's both significant and surprising, for example, that non-Western languages such as Turkish, Japanese, and Persian have 3 of the 5 most recent prolific translation histories of the Commedia. Indeed, there have been more recent translations into these 3 non-Western languages than into French, the language with the first published translation of the comedy, and German with the 2nd highest number of Dante translations of any language overall. Meanwhile, other languages haven't seen a new Dante translation of the entire Commedia in generations, while others, like Amharic, Kazakh, Mongolian, and Yiddish, have only ever had a complete translation of 1 canticle of the Commedia. Among those traditions with a complete translation of the Commedia, Welsh readers are the most unfortunate, with their only Commedia coming more than a century ago. Georgian readers haven't had a new translation since the end of the Second World War. Provençal, Finnish, and Slovene readers haven't had a new translation in the past 50 years. Azerbaijani, Bulgarian, Breton, Malayalam, Nepali, Slovak, and Urdu readers haven't had a new translation of the Commedia since the collapse of the former Soviet Union. And Belarusian, Galician, Irish, Latvian, Maltese, and Romanian readers haven't had a new complete translation of the Commedia since the 1990s. These languages have thus been less receptive to new translations of the comedy. Moreover, in translation, Dante's comedy has been adapted into different literary genres. In some languages, such as in Italian, there are comic or manga adaptations of his work, as well as into Dutch, English, Hungarian, Norwegian, and Turkish. In other languages, there are plays based on his comedy, such as in Finnish and Swedish. In still other languages, there are retellings of his masterpiece for children, as in Japanese, Portuguese, and Romanian. The data I've collected thus allows us to chart the different entrances of the comedy onto the world stage in translation, and suggest new paths of research for understanding why his text was translated first in some languages and not in others, and why his text has not been translated into many languages at all. In fact, Dante's comedy remains untranslated in the overwhelming majority of living languages. Perhaps that should not be surprising. We know that there are over 7,000 languages, as the most recent statistics from Ethnologue indicate. Indeed, it's not difficult at all to find a language where Dante's masterpiece has not been translated. Among the top 20 most spoken languages in the world, the Commedia hasn't been translated into 7 of them, as you can see on the slide. So Hindi, Indonesian, Marathi, Swahili, Telugu, Western Punjabi, and Yue Chinese. Thus, the fact that more than 30% of the top 20 world languages are without translations of the comedy is clearly statistically significant, showing a lack of a global canon. Moreover, we can point to another continent, Africa, where Dante is almost entirely absent except in ex-colonial languages. The complete comedy has not been translated into any of the more than 2,100 indigenous African languages. In short, the new data allows us to concretely identify countries and languages where Dante does not effectively circulate at all, at least his Divine Comedy. So the question arises, if Dante is not a household name in Malaysia or Kenya, for example, does this change our notion of whether he is a canonical figure? This certainly demonstrates both that literary canons change dramatically in different parts of the world, and that Dante is not a canonical author across the world. Another way that a sociological history of translation studies can illuminate the reception of Dante's comedy is by examining it through the lens of censorship. This is important both with regards to the study of the interpretation of Dante overseas, but also in terms of understanding the reasons why the Divine Comedy is translated less in certain historical, political, and religious contexts. As Jeffrey Einboden and others like Francesco Gabrielli have noted, the principal problem facing any Muslim translator of Dante's great work is the 28th canto of Inferno. Here, Dante portrays Muhammad as disemboweled for his sin of being a sower of schism and the leader of a heretical faith. As the passage goes in Robert and Jean Hollander's translation on the slide, when I was caught up in the sight of him, he looked at me and with his hands ripped apart his chest, saying, "See how I rend myself. See how mangled is Muhammad." Ahead of me proceeds Ali in tears, his face split open from his chin to forelock. And all the others whom you see sowed scandal and schism while they lived, and that is why they here are hacked asunder. And then this is Dante's original. Mentre che tutto in lui veder m'attacco, guardomi e con le man s'aperse il petto, dicendo, or vedi come io mi dilacco, Vedi come storpiato e Maometto, dinanzi a me sen va piangendo Ali, fesso nel volto dal mento al ciuffetto. E tutti gli altri che tu vedi qui, seminatori di scandalo e di scisma, fur vivi, e però son fessi così. The most famous Arabic translation of the comedy was translated by the Egyptian Muslim translator Hassan Uthman in 1969 during the reign of President Nasser. Jeffrey Einboden noted several fundamental shifts that Uthman followed in his Arabic prose version. Uthman entirely cuts 42 lines from the 28th canto of Inferno, where Muhammad and Ali are pejoratively described, Ali, the cousin and son-in-law of Muhammad. Uthman chose not to make the gap in line numbers evident in his translation. This meant that the Arabic reader does not know that such an omission has been made unless he or she reads to the end of his footnotes, such as this passage. As Uthman writes, I eliminated from this canto, insofar as I judged them inappropriate to translate, the verses about the Prophet Muhammad, in which Dante made a huge error, influenced by the common opinion in that epoch held by the educated and the masses about the great prophet. The paratextual elements of Uthman's translation are clearly oriented towards a Muslim readership, with numerous footnotes pointing out parallels between Dante's text and Islamic theological texts, and with Uthman footnoting Catholic dogma, quote, according to the Christians or according to Christian doctrine. It's thus apparent why the translation activity of Dante is much less common in Muslim societies. In fact, Dante's comedy hasn't been translated in 41 of the 51 Muslim predominant countries in the world. And even in some of the Muslim countries where it has been translated, the translators are not Muslims, but Christians. While the religious type of censorship is absent from English language translations of the comedy to such a degree, English language translators have nonetheless often censored their texts, not with regards to religion so much, but with regards to the potentially objectionable low style of the original Italian. A classic example comes from the most popular 19th century English translation of the comedy by Henry Francis Carey, his 1814 translation, as studied by Edoardo Crisafulli, where Dante describes un col capo si di merda lordo. Carey tones it down to, I marked one with his head so grimed. When Dante explicitly speaks of farting, for example, Egli avea del cul fatto trombetta, and dove si trulla, Carey merely refers, as you can see into the slide, to the sound obscene in the hinder passage. Carey's practice of bowdlerization is characteristic of his time and place, just like the above-cited Muslim translator, yet he was by no means alone. Other English translators censored even more blatantly, as in J.A. Carlyle's 1849 prose version, where anatomy has been entirely excised, and he of his had made a trumpet. If one compares these alternatives to the 21st century translation by Burke and Sanders, as you can see on the slide, then we could see how accepted conventions in English poetry have changed in the meantime. I want to present two countries now with important histories of Dante translation, which are both absent, as far as I know, from practically all Dante scholarship written in English. These two countries are Albania and Armenia. In both countries, political repression has played a significant role. In both countries, there's been a significant debate over national languages. The relationship of Dante and Albania is particularly fraught, as is evident in the scholarship of critics such as Mirjana Bulija and others. As the Albanian artist Adrian Paci said, almost all Dante translators in his country in Albania were imprisoned or exiled. Italy ruled Albania as a protectorate during the end of World War I until 1920, and then Italy invaded it in 1939 and ruled over it for 4 years. During this time, Italy fostered a cult of Dante in Albania and aimed at cultural hegemony. Yet when Albania became a communist state under Enver Hoxha, previous Albanian figures who had worked with the Italian fascist government were forced to go into exile. Sir Ernesto Colizzi, translator of selected canti from the Commedia and a widely read 1930s anthology, had to leave Albania and move to Italy. Catholic writer and translator of Leopardi, Paško Djeci began his translation of the comedy in 1937 when he was still at high school. He graduated from the University of Rome in 1942 and then returned to Albania as a high school teacher. But early into the new communist regime of Hoxha, Djeci was one day arrested, accused of trying to overthrow the state. He was sentenced to 5 years of hard labor. During this time, he would wake up early before his shift, translate a few verses, and return to the translation when possible after his hard day was over. After his release, he couldn't find work for a couple of years and had to work as a manual laborer. When the state subsequently allowed him to teach, it was only far away from his family and home. Yet once Hoxha learned of his translation of Dante, he had Geci return to work in Tirana, and upon the publication of his translation, Geci was given a professorship in Latin at the University of Albania. After Geci, the second translator of the complete Commedia into Albanian was Mark Ndoja. Ndoja only joined the Communist Party in 1944 after the murder of his friend. He would go on to become the head of the Albanian Writers' Union. Yet Ndoja couldn't accept socialist realism and criticized party leaders and the government in verse. He was imprisoned for 4 years. From 1960 to 1964, he translated Italian and Latin literature into Albanian, such as Dante and Horace, and Albanian literature into Italian. In 1964, Ndoja sent a letter to the Albanian dictator Enver Hoxha, asking to have his own translation of Inferno published. And for this, he was interned on the Albanian island of Zvernik. Ndoja would suffer a fatal stroke in prison the day before he was supposed to be set free. Another Albanian translator, Cesar Curti, taught at the University of Albania from 1962 onwards, but in 1976, he was fired for talking to his students about Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and Havel, and sent to work in the copper mines in Kerbnesh, not allowed to publish for the next decade. According to his Wikipedia page, edited by a family member, he's focused on translating works by poets and writers such as Dante to underscore his opposition to the violence exercised against human rights in his country and to contribute to the establishment of democratic thinking in Albania. Finally, Hector Sheneparente, poet and translator, was born into a politically troubled family. His father was sent to prison for 20 years for destroying a family portrait of Hoxha. And as a consequence, his family, including his son Hector, was mercilessly treated by the regime. Sheneparente was able to complete his translation of the Inferno, but it was only published posthumously. From the linguistic point of view, there are two main types of Albanian: Tosk, which is a standard form nowadays, and Geg, which is a non-standard form, even though it has an illustrious history. The Albanian dictatorship of Hoxha delegitimized writing in Geg Albanian. Yet both Geci and Ndoja composed their translations in this type of Albanian, whereas Curti and Sheneparente translated into standard Tosk Albanian. So the use of language variety in these translations is inscribed within a specific ideological and political perspective. Now we'll turn to Armenia. Here I'm relying on the work of the Armenian scholars Sona Haritutian, Nerses Ternesian, and Mesrobio Ganasyan. The reason why Armenia stands out can be found in the fact that Armenian was the first country to convert to Christianity outside of the Roman Empire in 300 CE. The Armenian religious community has a close connection with Italy, and specifically Venice, where the Armenian Mekhitarist congregation has resided since the early 18th century on the Venetian island of San Lazzaro. The other countries in the South Caucasus, besides Armenia, so Azerbaijan, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Mongolia, don't have such a religious link, and this explains the relative lack of translations there. Armenian translations of Dante flourished both in the religious Armenian community in Venice, as well as in Armenia itself, despite the country being under Soviet domination from 1920 until 1991. Like Albanian, there was a language debate over which form of Armenian to use, whether classical Armenian, called Grabar, or modern Armenian, called Askar Habar. And owing to the Armenian diaspora, two different forms of modern Armenian developed, Western and Eastern, both comprehensible to Armenian speakers, but nevertheless with significant differences. Dante was first translated into Armenian during the 19th century Armenian Renaissance, and published, in fact, in Italy, not in Armenia. The spur to translate Dante came through the vast translation activity of the Armenian congregation in Venice. In fact, it was due to the Armenian monks who were translating Dante that Dante was first mentioned in Armenian literature at the turn of the 19th century as the famous Italian poet, the father of the Italian language. In general, there was a chorus of praise for Dante and his immortal masterpiece, and the words of the 19th century Armenian friar Ambrosius Galfeyan. There was, however, at least one harsh voice against Dante in the first half of the 19th century, namely the Armenian friar Mateusz Magak Teopilans, who stated that nobody had managed to falsify and deride the holy Christian faith to the extent Dante did in his work. Translation activity began in Armenian during the mid-1850s, and the first volume of Armenian Dante translations was published in 1875 under the title of Terzine Scelte della Divina Commedia, that is, Chosen Tercets of the Divine Comedy, translated by Father Davide Nazaretian into classical Armenian. Nazaretian would translate the entire comedy by 1900, but never had it published. This was apparently because more people by then, by 1900, spoke modern Armenian than classical Armenian, as well as the fact that Arshen Gazikian was known to have studied his own translation into modern Armenian. In 1902, Arsen Gazikian, Armenian Mekaterist monk and translator of other 30 works into Armenian, from the Iliad to Tasso's Jerusalem Liberata and Milton's Paradise Lost, published the first canticle of his eventual complete translation of the Commedia in Venice. At the Abbey of the Armenian Mekaterist congregation on San Lazzaro, he would finish in 1924. He adopted unrhymed hentasyllabic verse in Inferno and Paradiso, but prose for the Purgatorio. As Sona Harat-Yudian explains, quote, at the beginning, Father Arsen Gazikian translated into classical Armenian. He often used to joke that he even dreamed in classical Armenian. Later, however, he came to the conclusion that modern Armenian had by then become a language that could be used even for the works of the great classics. During these years, modern Armenian was purified from the influences of the classical language. Through his translations, Gazikian was one of its main promoters. He had a significant role in establishing modern Armenian status as a literary language, not without provoking reactions from the remaining purists, unquote. During the Soviet era, two notable Armenian translations of Dante were carried out, both of which show evidence of the ideological pressure faced by Armenian translators. One translation was a selection of passages from the Commedia, and the other translation was a complete Commedia. So while Vagershak Norenz only translated several canti from the Commedia, he utilized terza rima for the first time in Armenian. Norenz relied at least partially on Russian translations and was a communist writer and thus acceptable politically speaking. Meanwhile, Arbun Tayan grew up in an orphanage in Turkey, but attended an Armenian high school in Venice before returning to Armenia. Tayan's translation was written in Eastern Armenian compared to Gazikian's Western Armenian. While Tayan didn't use terza rima, in contrast to Norenz, he also shunned free verse. Tayan's translation was in what we could call the Schlegel Titsine, namely with the first and third verses rhymed, but not the second. As befitting a translation published during Soviet times, his translation was introduced by a Russian critic, but it's unclear whether this was a requirement to avoid being censored. The next and final Armenian translator of Dante was Ruben Gulian, a translator predominantly of Russian poetry. Unlike the other translators, he never spent time in Italy or studied Italian professionally. However, that didn't stop him from translating the entire Commedia into terza rima for the first time in Armenian, using previous Armenian and Russian translations, such as Mikhail Luzinski's, as models. Gulian also translated Dante's Vita Nuova. Besides translating Dante, many Armenian poets wrote poems inspired or influenced by the Italian poet. As scholars note, the preferred canticle by Armenian writers and translators is Inferno. As Sona Harat-Yudian writes, Armenians find the Inferno to be a reflection of their personal suffering, and here she's referring most prominently to the Armenian genocide at the hands of the Turkish state during 1915. So, the well-known Armenian poet Siamanto's poem Mulberry describes the Armenian massacres as a Dantesque trip of deaths and ashes. Siamanto himself would be killed by Turkish gendarmes near Ankara in the summer of 1915. Hovhannes Tumanyan, the national Armenian poet, clearly recalls Dante with his own poem entitled In Front of Hell, where Tumanyan specifically speaks of the Armenian Inferno. The Armenian writer Yegishe Cherenz likewise makes the influence evident in his long poems Dantesque Legend, written in 1915 and 16, and his Vision of Death, written in the early 1930s. In this latter poem, Dante is the poet's guide to the past events of the Armenian people, including both the genocide as well as the Russian Revolution, which would eventually lead to Cherenz's death in the 1930s Stalinist Great Terror. A final poet here to mention is Hovhannes Shiraz with his poem Armenian Dantesque, censored and published only after the independence of Armenia. This poem also features Dante guided by the poet narrator Shiraz, who leads the Italian poet on an unbearable tour of the Armenian genocide. Now I'd like to mention a few other translators from other cultures whose lives were cut short by political terror and genocide. Excuse me. In Ukrainian, the first complete translation of the Divine Comedy was carried out by the poet Mikhailo Drey-Kamara during the first half of the 1930s. Drey-Kamara, a neoclassicist poet, was a professor of Ukrainian literature and linguistics at different Ukrainian universities, as well as a prolific literary translator from numerous languages. In February 1933, he was arrested by the authorities and sent to prison for 3 months. He was subsequently unable to return to any of his jobs. He was then rearrested in 1935, charged with counter-revolutionary terrorism, that his own poetry was deemed reactionary was certainly a contributing factor, and sent to the infamous Kolyma Gulag. He starved to death there in 1939, where he sacrificed his life to save another prisoner. In Holland, poet and novelist J.K. Rensburg, self-taught learner of Italian, had his complete terza rima translation of Dante published in the first decade of the 20th century. Rendsburg was a renowned Bohemian, but a legendary outcast. People called him the Jewish Grail Seeker, owing to his unconventional mystical ideas. He was incredibly poor most of his life. His translation of Dante was never popular, nor was it ever reprinted. He also translated Boccaccio and Balzac. As a Jew, he was arrested by the Nazis at the beginning of May 1943 and killed in Sobibor death camp. A third such exemplar is a Yiddish writer, Shmuel Nahum Stern. Born in Lithuania and resident in Vilkomir, a city near Vilnius, Stern had his free Yiddish translation of Inferno published in Kaunas in 1932 under his pen name Shmuel Kokov. We know hardly anything about him, besides three things. First, that he participated in the Third Aliyah to Palestine, which meant he immigrated to Palestine in the first half of the 1920s, although for an unknown reason he came back to Lithuania afterwards. Second, that he wrote a collection of poems entitled Poems for Red Moscow. Chances are he viewed communist Russia favorably. And finally, that the Nazis killed him in Lithuania during World War II. I'd like now to turn to some writers who translated into their native dialects, especially to raise the prestige of their local languages. Two, for example, are the Croatian writer Slavko Kalčić and the German headmaster Karl Willicke. Slavko Kalčić, a writer and translator from a small town called Juršiši in the Istrian Peninsula, grew up speaking Southwestern Istrian, a language similar to Serbo-Croatian, but not identical. Southwestern Istrian is predominantly based on one of the three Serbo-Croatian dialects called Čakavian. Kalčić made the explicit choice of translating the Commedia into Southwestern Istrian and not into standard Serbo-Croatian, which is also called Štokavian. Kalčić was in fact the founder of the first Čakavian newspaper, as well as the founder and prime mover behind the first dictionary of his local Juršiši dialect, which he had conceived of in the 1980s, but left uncompleted at his death. Kalčić, in the words of scholars, had to face a similar problem to Dante when translating into his native tongue. Just as Dante chose the vernacular instead of Latin, so Kalčić chose Southwestern Istrian rather than the Serbo-Croatian standard. Kalčić aimed to ennoble his dialect, as well as provide a translation of Dante that children growing up in his local Istrian region could read and understand. Karl Willicke in Germany had a similar objective of giving prestige to his dialect, Plattdeutsch, through his translation of Dante. Willicke, a teacher and headmaster, was born and raised in Schmallenberg, Germany, a town in Saarland where people speak Low German, aka Plattdeutsch. He was a city councillor in Hagen for a decade and headmaster of a school until he was fired by the government in 1934 for refusing to hang a picture of Hitler on the walls. He started the translation of Dante that very year, although he wouldn't complete it until 1955. Willicke chose to translate the comedy not into standard German like everyone else, but into his own dialect. He wanted his language to achieve fame and prestige. He used Low German words that even the local farmers didn't know, and he provided translations of them into standard High German. And he also made new coinings of his own. These examples then show how translators chose their native dialects to translate Dante to raise the status of their mother tongues. This leads me to the last section of my talk, namely inherent problems in translating the Divine Comedy, owing to religious terminology. In East Asian languages like Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and Vietnamese, the very terms of the canticles, Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso, pose ineluctable translation difficulties, owing both to the influence of Buddhist traditions as well as the use in Chinese, especially of Protestant-inflected terms. The Chinese term for Inferno, Diu, refers to the Buddhist idea of continual but not eternal rebirth into this world. So as Alessandro Brezzi says, this Chinese Buddhist term actually corresponds far more to Dante's Purgatorio rather than Inferno, and this affirmation is seconded by the Japanese Dante scholar Michio Fujidani as well, who says that the Buddhist Inferno rather is similar to Dante's Purgatorio. This lack of correspondence is the motivation behind Fujitani's critique of the Japanese translator Jugaku Bunshu's use of conceptually different Buddhist terms in translating Dante. Similar difficulties abide in the translation of Purgatorio. The first Chinese translation of Purgatorio was entitled Jingjie, but this Chinese term refers above all to the Buddhist so-called Pure Land, also known as the Western Paradise, and therefore not to any purgatorial realm. Meanwhile, for paradise, Chinese translators chose either Tiang Tiang or Tianggu. Tiang Tiang was used by Jesuit missionaries to translate the Christian term heaven. Meanwhile, Tianggu is a term chosen by Protestant missionaries to express the translation of kingdom of heaven. This Protestant influence is also more visible in the Chinese translation of the Italian term Dio, God, as Clara Bulfoni and Nicola Grandi have shown. There's one authorized Chinese translation from Dio, according to the Catholic Church, which dates back to the 18th century, Tianzu. However, the most recent Chinese translations don't use that term, and instead use Shangdi, a term favored by Protestant missionaries to China. In short, the translation of Dante into Chinese is not heavily influenced by Catholic terminology, but much more by Buddhist and Protestant terms. Similar theological issues are raised by translations into monotheistic traditions such as Judaism and Islam. Immediately evident is the fact that in Judaism and Islam, there's no monolithic doctrine of the afterlife, in contrast with Catholicism, insofar as there is no central authority among all branches of Judaism and Islam, with Jewish rabbis and Muslim imams arguing among themselves without anyone having final authority. None of the three realms described by Dante, Inferno, Purgatory, and Paradiso, have exact equivalents in Judaism and Islam. For instance, scholars state that in the Old Testament, there's no trace of an established belief in the future life. What this means then is that a Catholic reader will understand very well what Dante means by all three terms, whereas a Jewish reader may very well not. One predominant conception among Jews is that some people, the good, never get sent to hell, which is generally called Gehenna or Tophet. Some people with mixed records get sent to hell for a period of up to a year before then leaving, and then the wickedest get sent to Gehenna, never to leave. In Islam, Jahannam, the Arabic term in cognitive Gehenna, is similarly limited in terms of the duration of suffering and has 7 levels, different from Dante. As for the concept of purgatory, well, there isn't such a realm in Jewish tradition where some form of purification does happen, however, in Gehenna. In Islam, there are 2 terms that refer to a sort of purgatory, barzakh and araf, but by no means do these 2 Arabic concepts map onto a purgatorial realm. Furthermore, the Catholic concept of paradiso does not match well with Jewish tradition for 2 reasons. First, because many Jews are secular, or in any case don't believe in a firmly determined future life. Second, because the Jewish concept of heaven, which in Hebrew is called Shemayim, is conceived differently from Dante's Paradiso, not merely in the number of heavens, but also because of the absence of Jesus, the Christian Son of God. Likewise, Islam's vision of paradise, Jannat in Arabic, does not correspond to Dante's, with its 8 different paradises full of sensory enjoyment, and like the Jewish heaven, without the intercession of Jesus. Yet while I've talked about other religious traditions besides Christianity, there's an important point to be made about Christian denominations. So while the Roman Catholic Church upholds purgatory, Protestant theology does not recognize purgatory, nor do the Eastern and Greek Orthodox churches. We can see how this plays out in a 2002 translation into Afrikaans by Delaman Duchoit, a retired gynecologist who subsequently dedicated himself to translation, spending 18 years translating the Commedia. As the critic Raniero Spielman points out, Delaman Duchoit translates purgatory as Dante se purgatorium, that is, Dante's purgatory, as if it were only meant to be the poet's and not anyone else's. Spielman notes that this is because of Duchoit's Protestant Calvinist background. The translator himself remarks on this, clearly differentiating his Protestant view from Dante's Catholic view on purgatory. And you can see on the slide, according to the Roman Catholic doctrine, there is a place in afterlife called purgatory or verur, where Christians who have sinned but died in penitence are being cleaned of their sins before being admitted to the heavenly paradise. For the Protestant reader, who is not familiar with the teachings of the Catholic Church, it is important as well to know that according to the dogma of that church, the prayers of believers who continue to live on earth can be of great importance for the soul of the deceased who find themselves in purgatory. So this goes to show that there's a vast gulf separating the theology of Dante's poem from that of non-Catholic translators, but that despite this theological chasm, Dante's poem still gets translated all the same into a range of highly divergent cultural traditions. I know we're getting close to the end of time now, so let me end with a quote by the great Albanian novelist Ismail Kadare, who once wrote about Dante, "The absence of a land to call his own made him create a kingdom from which he could never be exiled." It's thanks to the thousands of worldwide translators over centuries that Dante's kingdom has thus spread across much of the world. Thank you. I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Jacob. What a terrific presentation. And it's such a rich field. I'm sure there will be plenty of questions from our audience. Can I invite our audience members, please, to place any questions that you might have in the chat. And then I will put those questions to Jacob. We have plenty of time now for question and answers. I wonder, while our audience are formulating their questions, Jacob, if I could perhaps kick off. You present us your examples from Armenia and Albania. Terrific. I love the way you're working with these less represented reception traditions. Of course, it suggests that you're going to work through kind of encyclopedically through to from A to Z. Presumably, that's a misleading impression. I wonder if you could say a bit more about the kind of the structure of your project more generally, and how you're choosing your case studies.
Yeah, thanks for that, Duncan. So I'm currently writing a monograph about the global worldwide translations of Dante's Divine Comedy, and I'm trying to find whatever secondary sources and languages that I read about complete canticles or complete Commedia in other languages, especially in outside of the, well, English, French, German, Spanish, etc. So I rely both on secondary scholarship that I read, as well as contacting translators or Dante scholars in these languages for advice, comments. And then if all else fails, I will put things in Google Translate, essays by scholars, to try to see if I can understand anything that might be relevant, and then double check that with other sources as well.
It must be, I mean, it must be quite tempting in a way to fall back on the languages that you're most comfortable with and to use specific examples and kind of to drill down into the traditions of those languages. Do you find yourself having to kind of resist that temptation, or do you find it comes quite naturally? Are you naturally intrigued by the kind of the less well-trodden paths, should we say?
Yeah, I have to admit I'm more intrigued by the less trodden paths. So I've done a lot of work, I think, among them compared to what we normally might read in a conventional Dante encyclopedia, where they only cover a few different languages. Because I think there's so many fascinating stories out there that we don't know, that will be very exciting, at least for me to learn and hopefully to pass on as I can.
Right. Yes. So do you, and thinking about the examples that you gave where you were able to drill down even within those traditions from Albania and Armenia, I suppose I was wondering whether you find that, because of course it's you're working on the level of the numbers of translations, and the methodology that you're using is quite quantitative. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering whether there are examples of the text of Dante's text becoming productive in the receiving literary cultures. Are you finding that as well as having a certain number of translations, that these translations are kind of hitting home in a way? Are you looking into numbers of the size of print runs, for example, and the numbers of copies in libraries, let's say, and ways in which perhaps then the readers of these translations, if they are themselves literary writers, they're incorporating Dante into their work? I like the examples that you showed of the Armenian writers who are citing Dante in their titles and so on. But I'm thinking things like, Abandon Hope, or Ye Who Enter Here, ways in which certain bits of Dante have rather established themselves in English and in English literature. Do you find that in the traditions that you're looking at?
Well, it's a very good question. And it gets to the heart of whether my study is looking really at the reception of Dante and other cultures on a scale that also deals specifically with their literary traditions or not. And so, for example, I didn't say anything about Albanian writers besides quoting Kadere, but I'm, because of the fact that there's so many different traditions, I'm finding that it would be impossible to try to cover that in all of the traditions, or even in many of the traditions, whether for lack of secondary sources and my my ignorance of the literary traditions. So I'm trying to focus especially on closer study of just how Dante's comedy has been translated, how often, what are the problems in specific cultures. I think the question of Armenian poets and their reception of Dante is so closely tied in a way that often is not the case in other cultures, that I thought it was relevant to speak about here. But it's not something that I would generally be looking at across all of the literatures. Ideally, you would need, it's a real team of scholars to do this. And in that sense, my monograph is meant not to be any last final word on anything, but simply to open up to for further to allow other people who have greater expertise in so many other cultures to take it much further than I'm able to.
Thank you. A question in the chat from Philip Wilson. Great talk. Where do you place radical translations like the relocation of Philip Terry?
That's a great question. Thanks, Philip. In fact, in a piece about translations of the classics, I cite Philip Terry's translation, including it as a translation of Dante's Inferno, even though it's so different. So I have a bibliography that will form part of, that was one of the chapters of my book, and in that I wouldn't include Philip Terry's translation, but I will talk about it in the English section of Dante translations, because it's so different from Dante's source text that it definitely bears a translational relationship, but I feel it would be unhelpful and not entirely consistent were I to put it on the level of a translation by the Hollanders or Singleton. I happen to particularly love Philip Terry's translation as a poem. Yeah, but thanks for that question.
A question from Yasser Aman. Don't you think the concept of purgatory is similar in Islam and Christianity, and that's why the objection to Dante's depiction of purgatory might have been similar? So a question about the differentiation that you're making between notions of purgatory in Christianity and other world religions.
Thanks for that question. I guess I would say that I was focusing on the conceptualization of a purgatorial realm in Islam compared to that in Dante's comedy and in Catholicism. And I'm no expert at all in Islam, and it's something that I need to continue to further my reading on. But it's, to my understanding, the imagery of a purgatorial realm with all of the theological background behind it is not identical or similar enough between Dante's Catholic conception and an Islamic conception of purgatory.
Thank you. I was fascinated when you were talking about dialect translation raising the prestige of a version of a language, and I mean, it reminds me of work that I've done on the history of Bible translations and how so often, kind of for the same reasons, languages that are emerging perhaps from the shadow of a larger neighbor will want to have a text like the Bible or a text like Dante in the language. And I wonder if you're finding this happening often, and if so, is it still happening, or is it typical of particular moments, such as, I don't know, the emergence of other vernaculars in the early modern period?
Well, it's a very interesting question. I think that it is currently continuing, despite the standardization of so many languages, national languages. So, I mean, most recently, I would say in the last 20 years, there was a translation into Vlach or Aromanian, which is a language without a stable state. And so I think all the more so in the political environment we live in which there's a lot of regions of nation states that want to separate, that's a factor as well in inciting people to to translate into their language and ennoble it, enrich it. So I don't see it as something that's relegated to the past. I think it could certainly happen nowadays as well.
Mm-hmm. A question from Ole. Are you aware of any attempts to translate the comedy into a medieval, in inverted commas, target language? The only example I know is Rudolf Borchardt.
Yes. Yeah, thanks, Ole, for that question. And Duncan Borchardt, definitely. The other translation that I know of, especially, is Émile Littré's translation of the Inferno into Ancien Français, so into medieval French, with actually a French that antedates Dante's Divine Comedy. Then there's the translation by André Pézard, which is a canonical mid-late 20th century translation, but that incorporates medieval elements, unlike Littré's translation, which is very philologically accurate with regard to ancient French. But those are the only two examples. If there's any other ones, I'd be very, very happy and interested to hear about them.
Did you find that there was a kind of spike in translations in 2015, for example? Because there was we mentioned the opening, the Dante year, which is coming up, but there kind of just was one fairly recently in 2015, which was the 750th anniversary of his birth. And again, I'm thinking of some work I did on Doris Lessing for the conference that we had at UEA last year, and I looked at translations of Lessing and attempting to do something similar to you with that methodology, and looking at the kind of the broader patterns of translations. And of course, when Doris Lessing won the Nobel Prize, then there was a big spike of translations shortly afterwards. And it so often happens, doesn't it? It's a feature of the publishing market that anniversaries and big prizes and so on are used as useful kind of pegs on which to hang new commissions, new translations. Do you find that with have you found that recently with Dante translations or other previous anniversaries?
Yeah, thanks. So certainly 1921 and 1965, there was an immense amount of critical scholarship and also new translations that followed. There was, for example, in Latvia, the newfound Latvian state was very anxious to come out with its own first translation of the Commedia into Latvian in 1921, and they ended up finding a translation that had been just completed by a very, basically somebody who lived in a poorhouse, but and it became a quite well-read translation. 1965, the anniversary there as well, stimulated a lot of translations. I haven't actually done looked yet about 2015. I do need to do that. And my guess as well is that 1865 was a crucial year as well. So those definitely play important roles, Duncan.
And I mentioned in my introduction that you're working on a volume relating to the Vita Nova as well. Are you doing any kind of comparisons with other work of Dante's as part of your monograph project? Or I mean, it's kind of it's a crazily big field already. I suppose I kind of I almost feel sheepish asking this question, but there would be, I'm sure, some interest. But I suppose there's such an imbalance between the canonicity of the two works.
Yeah, I haven't. I'm focusing right now just on the canonicity of the comedy, but ideally, yeah, the Vita Nova would pose. I mean, it would work very well together were there enough time to do that.
There's a contribution from Guillaume Cunil in the chat regarding medieval translations of the comedy. Catalan translation 1459 by Andrew Febrer, and the Spanish translation by Enrique de Villena in 1428, among others.
Yes, absolutely. at first I didn't know how to include them in my monograph, and in fact I had thought about not including any reference to them, but of course that needs to be said. There were not only those translations which were very important, and Februar's was then reprinted as well later on, but there were also Latin translations in the 1400s. So and there's a whole string of manuscript translations. It's just that they obviously they either didn't circulate in printed form, or they did, but many centuries after their composition, which affects their reception.
Just following on from Philip's question earlier, Philip raised the question of the retranslations and the way in which, for example, in English, because of the existence of many previous translations, someone like Philip Terry can translate in a very different way against that backdrop. And I'm thinking as well of Clive James's recent Dante translation, where he's aiming to translate without footnotes and to incorporate any contextual information that would ordinarily have been provided in footnotes into the text of the translation itself. So experiments like this come, I suppose, more and more frequently when a tradition builds up in the way that has happened in English, at least. And I'm wondering if you're finding that, if you're able to examine kind of the texture of the translations in other traditions, and I would expect that kind of diversity is apparent in those diversity of approach of translation technique in other traditions as well.
Yes, it is. For example, I read about a translation into Japanese done in the 1950s by a poet whose name right now escapes me, but he was very influenced by Italian neorealist film, and he translated the Inferno, eliminating Virgil entirely and trying to minimize as much as possible the dialogue of Dante, wanting to present the Inferno as much more objective without the subjective voice of Dante intruding. So it's a, I mean, and there were many translations into Japanese, so he had this tradition to draw on forced translation, but it's difficult also to evaluate them without knowing the language of the translation. So, right. But it does occur.
And are there examples? I mean, are there examples where a Dante translation appears, or other, perhaps what one would expect to be more obvious Western texts, where there's been a particular link to Dante, which has kind of led to what kind of surprisingly early translation?
Well, it's difficult to say. I mean, we can think of translations of Dante into, well, for example, there are many translations into Indian languages, not Hindi, surprisingly, but into other Indian vernaculars like Assamese or Malayalam or Tamil, that conceivably occur before translations of other Western works. But again, it's difficult because you would have to find out when, you'd have to know the translation history of Western literature in those specific contexts to be able to determine what Dante is being translated before. So it's often the case that, for example, there's, I think he's the Commedia translator, which is another Indian vernacular, who's translated Milton, the Iliad, the Odyssey, Dante's Comedy. I mean, you have these really amazing feats of translation activity in many languages that we have no idea about. So.
Thank you. I'm not sure that there are any other questions in the chat. If you have a final question, do please put it in the chat. I have one more question for you, and again, it's a kind of, well, if you had infinite time and infinite resources, I'm just thinking about the ways in which, well, Moretti and those who are influenced by his approach are very often tempted by visualizations of the of the data. And I'm wondering whether you're exploring different visual techniques for presenting the data that you have.
I'd like to, but it's something I need to work on, actually. And if you have any suggestions, obviously, as I proceed with the project, I'll be very happy to hear them. Yeah, so, but at the moment, I can't say I do. I'd like to find some though.
Well, I think there are no more questions in the chat, so I think we should let you go, Jacob. You've been very generous in your responses to our questions. Let me perhaps just remind everyone that we have a couple more BCLT research seminars in our series before Christmas, and next up is our current translator in residence, William Gregory, who will be speaking on the 25th of November about whose voice translating the plays of Bosco Cayo. But that's, in other words, in a month's time. But for now, can I thank once again our speaker for today, Jacob Blakesley, for a really fascinating introduction to what is clearly a massive project, which and you presented some really fascinating aspects of the project today. So thank you, Jacob, for sharing those with us. Thank you, everybody, for participating, and in particular for your questions. And hope to see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks, Duncan, and thanks to all of you for coming to listen.